At the turn of the last century, the National Library of Ireland was a focal point of intellectual and cultural activity in Dublin. It was also to loom large in the everyday life and restless imagination of James Joyce, who was to immortalise it in a portrait of the artist as a young man, and later, most notably, in Ulysses. For the young Joyce, the National Library was a haven, an intellectual refuge from a harsh world, a treasure trove of literary adventure, sometimes just a warm place to read and write.
I think we are very aware of him being a presence. You're aware sometimes that you may well be handling books that Joyce and his contemporaries handled. Yes, you're very aware of standing on the shoulders of giants. The building itself was opened in 1890. It was enormously popular. It was open Monday to Saturday from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. and it was the main public reference library for Dublin. The main library building is largely unchanged, as now one goes up the stairs. There was a turnstile which clicked and indicated the number of readers, and you went into the reading room and you sat down and started reading.
One thing to remember about the National Library is that it was new, and it was established drawing upon the scholarly people who were in the city. So you have at the library a staff that is learned and literary, but also a student body, and there's a kind of electricity in the room of a whole society coming together over books.
One of the lovely things about working in the National Library is that you get the sense under that great dome of being in the kind of room that Yeats and Joyce and many others worked in. And you can get a sense in the reading room of what it would have been like to be surrounded by people like Yeats and Joyce, marking up the proofs of what they'd written.
At this time, Dublin was in the throes of the Irish literary revival, an intense period of cultural renewal and reawakening, which prefigured the later birth of a new Irish state.
Obviously, the drive for home rule and the related, if not completely parallel, drive for kind of cultural identity to be created through drama and literature, to some extent music, language and art, certainly galvanized young people. There's a society, in other words, that is where all that is solid is melted into air, and what it will be is up for speculation.
Joyce, a precociously talented young man, would have accompanied his fellow students from University College on their frequent pilgrimages across St. Stephen's Green to read, write and mingle at the National Library on Kildare Street.
Joyce, of course, was a university product, but I think required somewhere like the kind of world of the library to meet people. Well, people like Yeats. Yeats and Joyce met first. Their first rendezvous was arranged at the National Library.
It was located absolutely between Trinity and UCD, which at the time was in Stephen's Green. And because students gathered there, and because many of the librarians themselves were interested in writing and quite sort of academic literary figures, and because the writers themselves often congregated around the library, it was a kind of meeting place and a kind of focal point for intellectual discussion. And Joyce, as a student at UCD, would have been a kind of regular user of the library.
For Joyce, as for a lot of his peers, the library would have been somewhere that he could get access to intellectual materials that took him outside the world of Dublin. It was somewhere social. It was somewhere where young people were really encouraged. At one stage, there was a suggestion that the students who came from University College should be prevented from sitting on the steps outside the library, that they lowered the tone. And Thomas Lister, who was the librarian at the time, said no, they must be allowed to sit there, because this is their library.
The National Library takes centre stage in Ulysses in the Scylla and Charybdis episode, where Stephen Dedalus visits and engages the librarians in literary discussion. While the physical representation of the library remains largely recognisable even today, Joyce was less factual and more fictional in his portrayal of the readers and staff.
The library episode itself is sort of actually set with great kind of physical specificity, in the sense that the scene is in the librarian's office behind the main counter, just off the main reading room. And in fact, it's very exact, the portrait, right down to the green coned lamp shining over the Quaker librarian's head. And that is pretty much exactly as it was. In fact, the library episode is unusual in terms of Joyce's fictional method, in the sense that he historicises real people and gives them their real names.
In some ways, the library episode is a really accurate depiction of the library. When you read the episode, you do get a real sense of what the library was like then and how close that is to the library today. Obviously, he uses the actual librarians of the time in the piece. Thomas Lister, Richard Best, William Miggy, he was known as John Eglinton. They all appear under their real names, and those are the librarians who would have worked there at the time and who were known to Joyce. From another point of view, there's quite a few details that don't really tally with the historical picture. Possibly the most interesting aspect is that the library was actually a really busy place, really bustling, really exciting, and that sense that the library was very busy, that it was full of young people, that Joyce, like Stephen, was one of those young people and was surrounded by a group of his peers, is something that doesn't come out very strongly in the episode.
It has been argued, for example, that the library episode represents literary revivalism as the affair of sort of self-involved, haughty Protestant Anglo-Irish minority, and that the revival kind of excludes the interests of kind of Catholics and Catholic writers. But in fact, when one really kind of looks at the chapter in more detail, the religious identity of the librarians is not really marked. What the librarians are really are kind of, in a sense, bookaholics. They're a kind of foil by which Stephen Dedalus can demonstrate his superior wit. They're highly kind of literary and involved in literary culture, and yet Stephen Dedalus is shown kind of every turn to be, more than a few steps ahead.
Fact and fiction fuse in our memories and our perceptions of the past, much as they do in the portrayal of the National Library in Ulysses, an institution and a novel forever entwined.
I suppose the relationship between Joyce and the library is a symbiotic one. I mean, both benefited. And while I think one can have misgivings about the portrait of the library and its staff in Ulysses, nonetheless has conferred immortality on those who appear in it. I don't know of another example in literature of a library and its staff being immortalised in that way in what is probably the greatest English language novel of the 20th century.